of the research, and also they include more strengths on the economic analysis and also resiliency questions. Then here's now I will say pass the button to the Anna Maria, and then he is newly I was appointed as a director of CREATE. That is one of the I would say key research center for the risk and economic analysis of terrorism event. That is the one only I would say selected from the Ministry of Homeland Security and from the U.S. government. And then here's of course the professor in Southern California in Price School of Public Policy. Definitely his area of the research, let's say roughly I can say that the economics of disaster, but he's a pioneer of the economic resilience. He has lots of citation in the relation to the to his papers. And then today, he will give us the keynote lecture on the impact of the COVID-19 on economy of the United States. It's I'm very much exciting to hear his presentation, and we want to run from him. Please welcome Adam for his let's say wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiro. I appreciate the nice introduction, and nice to see many of my friends here listening in. So I'm honored to have this opportunity to address the IDRiM members and guests today, even though it's only virtually. We're getting together under difficult circumstances, but I think the workshop is working out very well from having chaired a session earlier today with a lot of bright young presenters, and I think it was a great idea to put an emphasis on that group of our current IDRiM contingency, and hopefully some new members that we'll pick from there. So I want to thank Anna Maria, thank you, Hiro, thank Norio, Minetta, and other members who've made this possible today. Also to thank Ayuna Matthews, who works tirelessly on behalf of IDRiM. So I also want to start by acknowledging my co-authors, Terry Walmsley, who's a research fellow at CREATE and also a member of the Department of Economics at USC, and my other co-author, longstanding co-author and former PhD student from Penn State, Professor Dan Way, who is also a research fellow in the School of Public Policy with me. So by way of background, my talk today is part of a major research thrust that the research team is undertaking on COVID-19. And we're currently working on a short-term analysis using secondary data. We actually published a paper recently in Applied Economics Letters just on the mandatory closures aspect. We are just embarking on the long-term analysis in which we're going to collect primary data on health care costs, avoidance behavior, and pent-up demand to make our study more accurate. We have a project with the Centers for Disease Control on the impacts of a proposed new rule on contract tracing for international flights. And also, more recently, we're awarded a contract in association with ImageCat in the US for the use of satellite data on openings and avoidance. So I want to stress that the modeling approach that we are taking in these studies is that of economic consequence analysis. And this is an approach consistent with integrated risk management because it factors in such considerations as psychology, behavioral economics, healthcare issues, some aspects of engineering as well, and planning. And so it's able to capture the unique features of the problem. You know, COVID-19 is a disaster after all. So I'm comparing this to the standard macroeconomic approaches, and I'm going to be writing a separate paper comparing the way the disaster community approaches this and the way more standard macroeconomists who don't have much experience on disasters approach it. And my hypothesis is that they're likely to miss many subtleties, as well as some not so subtle features coming from the different direction. So this is an outline of the presentation. I'm going to talk about scenarios and the framework, talk about data inputs, an overview of the methodology and major assumptions, and then present the results and their interpretation, and conclude with some discussion of the major highlights and our future research. So because COVID-19 is so uncertain, we decided that we would model 3 scenarios, varying critical assumptions that are likely to affect the outcome. And so these start with the severity and trend after mandatory closures of the reopenings, the initial reopenings, possible second waves, the existence of travel bans, vaccine existence and timing, avoidance behavior, and what we call pent-up demand, which refers to deferred spending after reopening takes place and after the businesses are reopened. And it hopefully over time, people will overcome their fear of venturing out and shopping. So the causal factors that I'm going to be talking about are listed here. I will be going over them again, so I think with just, you don't have to have me read them, but you can see there are several causal factors, the obvious ones like mandatory closures, but also resilience taking place through telework, workforce declines due to health issues, consumption of workforce declines due to avoidance, changes in demand for healthcare services, increase in demand for communication services. I wish I would have bought stock in internet companies several months ago, and then pent-up demand. I should say, though, we have kind of an upper bound estimate because we haven't factored in countervailing policies in our analysis. So let me begin with the background on our CREATE economic consequence analysis framework. And what this is an elaboration of old-fashioned economic impact analysis in a more modern light and very, very extended to focus on key issues and modern advances in the way we approach analyzing the economic impacts of disasters. So the old approach was you had a disaster event scenario, and that would lead to target-specific economic impacts. And for many years until the 1990s, that was almost exclusively property damage. There was some discussion of the loss of life. One of the first innovations when economists came on the scene in the 90s was not just to look at property damage, but also business interruption, or the effect on the flow of the goods and services coming from the asset base. And these were fed into various models, often at that time just input-output models, to capture ordinary indirect economic impacts or multiplier effects. Well, the major advances we've brought to bear on this beginning in the early 2000s was adjustments for resilience, and I'll define resilience more carefully in a minute, but mainly what I'm talking about are things that are done to mute the negative impacts of disasters. It's basically synonymous with business continuity. And we also factored in behavioral linkages, which work in the opposite direction. These are usually related to fear and an exaggeration of the perception of the disaster, which typically exacerbates or makes things worse. Now, both of these have ordinary indirect impacts as well and add to the overall effect. Other things we've brought into the system are direct remediation costs. So in this context, this would be the costs of hospitalization and medical care for people affected by the coronavirus. And we also take into account mitigation costs, which would be, let's say, vaccines, or the costs of masks and other social distancing types of equipment, and potential spillover effects of those. In this case, it could be some negative side effects of vaccines. In other cases, mitigation can have both positive and negative side effects. So those feed in and have indirect economic impacts as well, and we get a sum total combination of all of these things. So background on economic resilience, there are two major perspectives I find. So there's a group of people, primarily engineers, that suggest, well, resilience is anything you do and everything you do to reduce losses, pre-disaster and post-disaster. And the focus is on the mitigation of property damage, though. On the other hand, there are a group, mainly social scientists, that want to limit resilience to actions implemented after the disaster strikes. But mind you, this doesn't deny and really builds upon the fact that resilience is a process and that you can build upon, you can build resilience capacity ahead of time and then implement it once the disaster strikes. So you can hold emergency drills, purchase backup generators, line up alternative suppliers, but they just passively reside there. And when the disaster strikes, then instead of just a drill, you take the action that you practiced, you plug in the emergency generator, you start working with alternative suppliers. So the latter perspective may strike some people as odd. Basically, they may ask, well, how can you reduce property damage after the disaster strikes? Well, the point is you can't, but that's not the point. The other dimension of disaster costs are business interruption, and that's exactly what this form of resilience is getting at. And essentially, this definition of resilience is synonymous with business continuity. So there are dozens of definitions these days of resilience, and it's almost become a very popular buzzword and makes people's eyes glaze over when you get into definitions. But I've studied resilience in about 10 different disciplines, and I've found that there are more commonalities than differences. If you study resilience in fields like planning or psychology or organizational behavior or ecology. And what I've done here is I've identified the essence of the definition in many of these fields, and practically all of them, and then presented the economics counterpart. So the general definition, going back to Halling, of static resilience is the ability of a system to maintain function when shocked. And the economic counterpart of that is the efficient use of remaining resources at a given point in time to produce as much as possible. And so this capitalizes and is consistent with the basic concept of economics being the science of scarcity and the need to use resources efficiently. And these resources are even more scarce in a disaster, and it makes it even more important. So the dynamic counterpart typically talks about the ability and speed of a system to recover, but it's primarily related to repair and reconstruction. So COVID-19 is very interesting in that sense, in that there's really hardly any property damage. And so we don't have to get into repair and reconstruction. We can focus on basic economic resilience. So from this has emanated a metric that I've used over and over. It's very similar to one developed by Shinazuka and Chang in the early 2000s when I developed mine. I think Hiro and others have used this definition as well. It's basically defining the resilience as the losses that you can prevent or avert from implementing a given resilience tactic divided by the maximum potential losses that would have taken place if you did not have implemented this tactic. So what are resilience tactics? Well, they typically emanate from the economic production function, and there are things we can do to cope with disruptions of critical inputs. We can conserve inputs, we can substitute inputs, we can relocate our business to a place where inputs are available, we can import inputs from outside the region. For instance, one of my first applications of this metric was to the economic impacts of the World Trade Center attacks, which were potentially very devastating, but almost 75% of the potential losses were reduced by the relocation of more than 1,000 businesses and government agencies from the Trade Center to other places in the New York area, rather quickly after the event. The other part I mentioned are behavioral linkages, and these are typically off-site responses associated with behavioral changes. In this case, we're talking about behavioral reactions away from people who are actually infected. And ironically, this can work both ways. Usually, in most cases, you have a social amplification of risks, work that Ortwin Wren and others have pioneered, and sigma effects that magnify the disaster. In this case, part of the problem is some people don't realize the threat. We almost have a understatement of some of these behavioral effects. But at the same time, we're starting to see in the US, they had a recent poll, and 50% of the people said they were not inclined to be vaccinated if a vaccine comes through because they're afraid it was rushed, or so there's an anti-vaccination group in the US. And so we have some serious potential problems in dealing with this through behavioral considerations. And we found in other studies that these behavioral exaggerations can lead to 2 or 3 order magnitude increase in the basic assumptions. And avoidance behavior is a key example in this context. People being afraid to venture out of the house or use public transportation. And here are some examples. You know, after you account for the resilience after 9/11, 80% of the remaining losses were due to a 2-year decline in airline travel and related tourism. And today, airline industries in the US are on the verge of going bankrupt because people are afraid to get on a plane. There are other fears too, but you can also say, some people say the government reacted in the US and the closings are too extensive, and that has caused losses as well. So in many cases, we have the behavioral linkages going in one direction only. COVID-19 is interesting because it is going in 2 directions. So if we revisit the causal factors that I mentioned early on, we quickly see that most of them relate to either resilience or behavioral linkage. Mandatory closures or stay-at-home orders all relate to behavioral considerations, the reopenings as well. Resilience through telework, telecommuting, which has helped get things, maintain things, is a form of resilience. Workforce declines due to health issues, that's probably the one exception, but consumption and workforce declines due to avoidance, people not wanting to go to work because it's dangerous. Changes demand for healthcare services, well, that has a behavioral linkage because many people are not going to the hospital for ordinary surgeries, not only because the hospitals are full, but people don't want to catch COVID-19 in the hospital. So they're putting off many elective surgeries. Increases in demand for communication services, another example of resilience, and pent-up demand. The time path of that will be highly dependent on how safe people feel once the stay-at-home orders are lifted. So from this, we've developed an economic consequence analysis tool called ECAT. It's a standardized capability to estimate the consequences of 30 plus types of threats. We have 10 modules already, and it's a decision support software tool for high-level analysis for risk management, where we can do resource allocation across multiple threats, and also rapid response. If FEMA needs to know approximately what the economic losses are going to be, unemployment, et cetera, this can help for estimates of remediation, aid, and recovery. And this tool is actually presented in the 2nd volume that was published in the Springer IDRiM book series in 2017. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors of that book, Finn Prager, Zhenhua Chen, and Sam Chatterjee. So getting us back to a summary of data inputs on COVID-19, let me do 2 things. I want to take a drink of water. I said to myself, well, I'll monitor my time on my computer, but my PowerPoint's taken up my whole computer, so I need to go get my cell phone. So while we're doing that, why don't you think of questions, and let's take a 30-second interlude so I can get my cell phone, and then I'll answer some questions on this first part of the talk. I'll be right back.
Yeah. Okay.
So are there any questions? Can you still hear me?
Yeah, of course we can hear
Okay,
you.
okay.
And then, do you want to have some questions?
Well, just clarification. Any clarification questions on the first part?
Okay, then basically you are now summarizing a kind of the impact assessment methodology, which is based on the ECAT. And then you are the basic inputs which is listed in the one slide before, and that would be obviously as an input. You will estimate the overall losses for the
impact on COVID-19. Right.
Okay.
Right. So that's a good you did my transition for me. So thank you very much, Hiro. I appreciate that. So these are some of our major data sources. We needed the extent and timing of stay-at-home orders and mandatory closures, list of essential critical infrastructure sectors that are allowed to stay open. We needed the basic GDP numbers by sector and by state. This is just on the US side. Also telework potential by sector. So these are all the assumptions in the US, but we'll see that we actually analyze the impacts of COVID-19 worldwide. And I'll explain that in a minute. So the sector closures, there's three categories of goods. Let me look at my watch. So I think you can read that on your own. Let's go again, service and trade. This is the extent of the stay-at-home orders in the US, which were pretty extensive. 42 of the 50 states and of the 51 counting the District of Columbia, in fact, had stay-at-home orders. We also measured telework, and this is telecommuting. These are based on averages before COVID-19, and so these numbers are probably higher now, and we'll make that adjustment as we do some primary data collection. But you can see that sectors like that depend highly on the internet, information, financial activities, professional and business services, 50% of the workers were working using telework to some extent before COVID-19, are readily able to do it since then. On the other hand, we all know leisure and hospitality, restaurants and hotels are the hardest hit, very limited ability for telework. Production, we put these numbers together and we've got percentage reduction of output by sector, and we can see that the manufacturing sectors under scenario 3 and very strong restrictions, you can't simply manufacture things over the internet, are almost 50% for all the manufacturing sectors. So the scenario 3, is much stronger in that regard. The modeling approach we use is CGE, Computable General Equilibrium Modeling. You can read the definition there, but the bottom line here is that the economy is characterized as a set of interrelated supply chains. So it focuses on interdependence across sectors and across countries. So we use something called the Impact Econ model, which relates to a model developed by Terry Walmsley and Peter Miner. Terry's the lead author of this, the paper, but mainly for running the model. And it's an extension of the GTAP World Trade Model, and consists of 141 countries aggregated into 3 regional groupings. The 2944, that you didn't give me the first 5 minutes or so give me a few more minutes, but thank you. All right, so we've got assumptions underlying the model. Let's get to the results. So this gives us the results. I need to move this a little so I can see all the columns. So here we have the major factors, causal factors, And we can see that we've got results for the US, China, and rest of the world. And the total impacts, I've just done the lower bound scenario, upper bound scenario. We have the USA has almost more than $3 trillion, which is almost 15% of the US GDP, the lower bound scenario, and almost $5 trillion on the upper bound scenario. And we can see that the mandatory closures are very powerful, but what will save us a lot of grief is the fact that pent-up demand is able to reduce the negative impacts by 1/3 for scenario 1 and by as much as 2/3 in scenario 3. In other words, people haven't been able to spend, and hopefully will venture out and start spending again and compensate some for the damage done to the economy. So we also find that most of the other factors aren't very significant at all. Maybe communication is a little bit on scenario 1, and then communication, avoidance behavior get to be much more significant in scenario 3. So interpretation, let's just go to the, most of this is why the impacts differ in the US than other countries. And unemployed workers have less money to spend and all, but the bottom part, a higher portion of the US is impacted by closures and for longer periods than other countries. In China, it was fairly short. We have greater importance of non-essential sectors in our economy. As countries get to be very advanced, they have larger service sectors. And finally, just to summarize, the hits on the US economy could range from 3.2 trillion to almost 5. The direct impacts on China would be rather small because, again, their closure was limited to a few weeks and in a small region of the country, relatively speaking. But since they're connected through trade, they weren't able to export their goods as much. Demand for their exports dropped significantly, and that had a significant adverse effect on them. The rest of the world, but that's all countries, including Europe, Australia, etc., are larger than the US, but not so much in proportion of population. So the influence of the causal factors, again, mandatory closures and reopenings are the major contributing factor. Avoidance behavior is swamped by mandatory closures in the early periods, but during reopenings is still very strong. And pent-up demand has this great potential to reduce the losses by 1/3 to 2/3, depending on the scenario. So in the future research, we are primarily going to collect data, primary data, on things like avoidance behavior, healthcare costs, telework, etc. And we'll also be using a dynamic model so we can trace the time path of the losses and recovery. And we'll also more generally be incorporating some of the countervailing policies in many countries, such as stimulus. So finally, I hope I've been able to convince people that this economic consequence analysis approach emanating from integrated disaster risk management can offer valuable insights in the COVID-19 and its economic impacts. So thank you for being a good audience, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and we have more than 20 minutes for the question and discussions. So, if you want to make some comments, you can put raise a hand, and I can point out. Are there any questions to Adam? I cannot see any hands.
Oh, I saw. Well, I saw tall.
Anna, yes,
Okay.
Please, Anna. Yes.
No, I just wanted to.
Show that.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Thank you very much. this is, so economic analysis is not my field, but this is very interesting. I was just saying very good. I think it was very easy to understand for a non-economic person like me.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Maybe
So I saw Talib had his hand up, so I saw him visually. So Talib and then Muneta had his hand up too.
Okay, good. So please, Terry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. Very good, very useful. Where you said that COVID-19 is such a disaster that it does not affect physical assets. I mean, no damage to buildings or infrastructure or anything like that, but economics and probably social infrastructure, mingling of people, and that has been affected. These facts and figures that we are seeing here is to do with COVID-19's impacts on economics of United States of America and probably other countries in the world as well, like China. Was it possible, or has it been done somewhere, somehow, at some by yourselves or any of your colleagues, that where the comparisons could be drawn between COVID-19 related disaster or COVID-19 as a disaster, as opposed to other disasters like, I don't know, hurricanes or wood fires, which are breaking out in California more often now. So could a comparison be drawn there, and would that lead to somewhere, which I can't think of? So I'm just shooting in the dark, probably. So just that, please.
Yes, two things to say. So I published a paper with my co-authors. I think the lead author is Finn Prager in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, which discusses a comparison of the impacts of disasters. And essentially what we did was we did some estimates with ECAT, and we looked at other estimates to make comparisons. So this was published about in 2017 or 18, International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. The other thing, I was recently asked to comment on the California wildfires. So the California wildfires have the potential to cause a couple of $100 billion worth of damages this year, and probably more if we get into health effects of the terrible air quality. And the thing I pointed out is that for most disasters, well, in all disasters, when you do estimate the consequences, you really have to do a probabilistic analysis. I could say a major earthquake in Los Angeles might cause $100 billion worth of property damage and $100 billion worth of business interruption. And if I were evaluating mitigation, it would be inappropriate to use that number alone. What I'd have to do is multiply that by the probability of occurrence of a distribution of earthquakes over time. So the chances of the big one taking place is 1 over 100, probably even less than that. But essentially you have to wind up multiplying this big number by a small number like 5% to say what the expected benefits really are. And so if you take that 100 billion, multiply it by 5%, the impacts are really only 5 billion. All right, that's still a lot of money. But what about wildfires? Well, wildfires are now turning into not just a 1 in 50 year, 100 year, they're happening every day, and they're likely to increase because climate change and development, intrusion into forested areas are both continuing and will continue. And you'll have these, not every year, because you have this cycle of heavy rainfall, which makes things grow, and then you don't have so many fires, but then there's the period of drought. So you'll have wildfires, probably a cycle of wildfires, half of the time in the next 50 years. And in which case that will add up and be comparable to the once in a lifetime or the average distribution of earthquakes and even pandemics. We're not going to have a pandemic every year, likely. It's, you know, if we say the last big pandemic was the Spanish flu, it was 100 years ago. So I think that's one of the things you have to keep in mind when you make this comparison.
Is it clear?
Well, Muneta,
Yes.
but Hiro, were you asking whether my explanation was clear to the group?
Yeah, of course, that depends on the kind of, let's say, how to account the cost also for the mitigation too.
Right, but mitigation of wildfires is extremely difficult.
Right.
Extremely, because you have, you know, a lot of people have pointed the utilities because a lot of them are caused by down power lines, so they should shut off the electricity ahead. Utilities are doing a little better, but the majority of the fires this time around have been caused by lightning strikes. Nothing you can do about lightning strikes, and by people's carelessness. And that's where behavior comes in again, and it's just that will take a long time.
Yeah, and that's also the kind, such a facilities or some equipments, or even for the kind of organization that may not, let's say, stay there entirely. It may be in economics. We should include some replacement period or maintain that functions, but that is a relatively longer period we should consider. And then
Yes.
that case, the complication to estimate the total cost in the context of the like a benefit of the economic benefit as an economic benefit of the actions, that is a bit complicated. So maybe just simply estimate the cost itself. I mean the impact at that period. Maybe not necessary for us to think of a kind of occurrence of the probability of the event itself. Maybe that is, of course, the purpose is a bit different, but
Okay.
yeah, I guess that is also the possibility. Yeah, I think I have several questions, but maybe Muneta want to make questions for you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes. For technical reason, I could not raise hand. Yes, because yes, I'm the Zoom host. And well, so my question or concern is a technical aspect of your model. And well, yes, you estimated this GDP loss based on CGE type of model, right?
Right.
And well, I am now yes very much interested in two things. One is that how well face-to-face meeting can be substitutable for online meeting. Now, yes, and actually, yeah, that is very, how to say, important focus from a viewpoint of, for example, the economic geography, or even the value of the transportation system will be, you know, based on the, you know, how a face-to-face meeting is very important to make a new idea or knowledge, right? So for that reason, yes, how did you formulate a model? You're considering that, you know, substitutability. That is the first thing.
Okay.
And the second point is that, well, if we think about the micro foundation, you know, that is individual behavior in CG analysis, then, well, for example, the countermeasure against COVID-19, coronavirus or pandemic, such as wearing mask, gives positive externality to others, right?
Right.
Yeah, that is, yes, not only for oneself, but that gives your positive impact to others. And so in that such a positive externality framework, well, so individual action results in the shortage of, you know, compared to social optimum, as you know.
Shortage of equipment?
No, shortage of, you know, the level of the countermeasures, preparedness, or, well, or compared to the social optimum.
Okay.
Yes, in other words, some governmental support or subsidy will be, you know, required.
Sure,
Yes,
sure.
within the simple, yes, a neoclassical framework. And so,
Okay.
yeah, on that 2 points, So this COVID model, CG-based COVID model must be unique, right? Yes, compared to other disaster model. So yes,
Right.
if you have
Okay.
some idea.
All right. So you've raised two good points, but I think let's say, and you know CG modeling too. It's highly dependent on the data you put in and refinements you make. So I think some of the problems are data problems, not CGE problems. They're going to be a problem no matter what model you used. All right. So an example would be your point about face-to-face meetings are much more effective in generating new ideas. And you lose something over the internet. I personally disagree in that I have worked for many years with people in other cities and countries, and found it very, very effective even before the internet. And then with the internet, you can share a whiteboard on the screen. It's almost like being in the same room. I know that my predecessor as director of CREATE used to go to Washington for 2-hour meetings. He'd fly all the way across the country just for a 2-hour meeting and come back. And I resisted that. I think you're going to see a lot less travel like that. I think people realize that it's kind of foolish in many cases. Obviously high level important meetings, but sort of standard meeting, a kickoff meeting for or a midterm reporting on a project or something. So, but if somebody were to do a study and find that this stifles creativity and innovation, then that can be factored into a dynamic CG model by the projections you make over time of the improvements in the productivity parameter, which you might say there's some baseline that says those are normally 2% per year improvements in productivity that you would factor it in. So maybe it should only be 1.8 because we're losing 10% of it as a result of this. So the CG model can accommodate it. The second thing you mentioned is called the contagion effect. And that's a very interesting thing that we should talk about offline sometime, because I think that's been understudied. And one of the key examples is and well, I don't know if Yoshio is on, but somebody's worked in electric power. In the United States, there's something called the interruptible service premium. And it basically says, well, you can pay a little bit more on your electricity bill and then be given priority as a customer if there's a shortage of electricity and they have to ration electricity. And what you have is an interdependency effect. And a classic example is Loma Prieta earthquake. The San Francisco airport paid for years this premium and thought it was in good shape, but its major fuel supplier didn't. And so it wouldn't have done the airport much good if it would have run out of fuel. So there is an interdependency effect. And so one aspect of this work Howard Kunrother and Jeffrey Heel did a dozen years ago on something called the contagion effect. There's probably the paper in the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty, highly cited. So I would refer you to that. But let's talk about that, because what the private decisions, what you're getting at, are not necessarily consistent with the social optimum. And in order to achieve the social optimum, sometimes you need to induce people to do the right thing, and so subsidies are necessary. But you don't need to subsidize their own entire behavior. You just subsidize the increment to their behavior that is necessary. So if people are walking around with substandard masks and that's all they're willing to buy, you give them a little bit of a government subsidy for the differential between the cost of a substandard mask and a good mask, for example.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, but on the first point, maybe, the CGE model might have not considered this space too seriously. But for example, urban economic model or economic geography model, right? The commuting time, well, determines the location of households or farms. And so, yeah, that finally makes the scale size of determines the size of the city, right?
Right.
So that framework may change when we, incorporate that telework or remote meetings.
Sure, but the point, the thing is that you collect new data on the reconfigurations and new data on the input requirements and travel demand and all of that. You know, you can think of a CGE model and the underlying social accounting matrix as an organizational framework for economic data. And so as new data become available, you change that social accounting matrix. And it calls for new combinations, different combinations, improve productivity, changes in the activity of sectors, and you base your CGE model on it. So it's a little more work, but it's worthwhile. And practically any other model has to do the same thing. It's not just a weakness of CGE that it doesn't have all that figured out automatically. It's the underlying database that you need to improve for all models.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure. Well, very good questions. I appreciate them.
Adam, let me have another question from my side. Actually, in the slide number 16, I think you showed that the kind of the, let's say, components of the, let's say, impact for the economic resilience in this event. Am I right?
Slide. Let me bring it up. Slide 16. You
16, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. It was 16 was well.
No.
60. No. Well, one of the this slide probably telework potential is able to. So ordinarily you would say that if you shut down a business, you can't produce at all. But if you look at the information sector, if 50% of the people can work remotely and not have to go to work, yes, you may shut down the office. People can't go to the office, but you can work remotely, and so you can expect that 50% of the activity of that sector, approximately as a first pass, would still be able to be produced. And so this is, you know, we adjust the closures. So if the closures, you closed 80% of the banks, financial activities, the actual physical banks, but 50% of the workers were able to work remotely, that closure would only be about 40% instead of 50. Now there are adjustments that are needed for certain types of workers, etc. But this is a good first approximation, and then you refine it by noting that, and then you take into account the consumer side. In this day and age, you know, can you imagine what would have happened if we would have had the coronavirus in 1960? We wouldn't be able to have this session. We'd hardly be able to do anything. Things would really be shut down. So our ability to do things in cyberspace is an immense feature of resilience, and is probably saved many lives, as well as helped save many dollar losses in the economy both.
Yeah, actually this partially answering Muneta's question, I think. If we collect such a data and actual output of the services, and then change the demand. Of course, the last thing may be very difficult. How can we explain the change, the demand change have happened? Because of the reason, because of the supply of the services actually decrease, or maybe just simply there was a consumer don't want to, let's say, consume that services. That is a bit complicated, but
yes. And so you have to consider the supply side and demand side, as a good economist should. And so what happens, though, is that during the mandatory closures, the supply side dominated, because even if people wanted to go buy something, they couldn't. All right. During the reopenings, you have fewer mandatory closures. It's mainly a demand side phenomenon. People, you know, even if you open your business tomorrow, many restaurants have opened and they're still only 25% full. Or the airlines are willing to fly their planes, but I think ridership is down to 10%. And there was a study released just the other day that said millions of people could have been infected on airplanes. Their filtration systems weren't anywhere near as good as people first imagined.
Yeah.
So it's a very concerning situation.
Yeah, and then even if, of course, this is the first trial to estimate the impact. So I appreciate your work, but your research also provides us a kind of some points how to collect data and how to estimate important parameters for the future modeling for the impact studies of the COVID event.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but I have another question that relates to maybe your future work. That is, you are mentioning longer-term effect too, right?
Right.
Right, and then everyone is concerning that what kind of the new normal brings our economy. What kind of changes? How can we interpret? That is a good thing or maybe not inevitable, but what would be the impact to our economy? That is also we should understand, I guess. So do you have some, let's say, comments on that? And the final one may be more difficult. Right. How can we interpret for your result for the two, let's say, find a better policy? Like the people, basically, this is the impact, I understand. Then what we should do? That is a question.
Sure, sure. Well, on the long term, you know, when I talked about long term, I'm talking about, you know, what would happen if COVID-19, we had second wave, third wave, what would happen if the vaccine were delayed. That's really what I mean by long term, not quite as good of long a time horizon as you mentioned in terms of permanent damage, permanent changes in the economy. And that's probably not anything I'll get into. That's probably out of my line of expertise. It's highly speculative too. But somebody should look at this. It's similar to, you know, the age-old question, are there long-term impacts of disasters? And that's so so, you know, the Kobe port is very famous in that regard. Katrina too, there are some things that never fully recover. And so it's interesting to determine why. Yeah. So you said you made one other point toward the end. What policies could we promote? Well, you know, obviously, social distancing and other policies would have been very valuable. Mandatory closures, perhaps earlier on, and those have been successful in places. I think I would point people to success stories, including China and the Wuhan province, closing that down, New York State. As far as economic policies, I think the stimulus has been important, and policies that find ways to help people get outside their house safely are very much in need as we work our way out of things.
Thank you, Adam. And then definitely we should compare the value of the life and the economic output.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that contrast definitely we should do. And, you know, that's always difficult, you know, that the value of statistical life is based on earning capacity. And one of the issues is that most of the deaths are older people. And if you take this value of statistical life seriously, you would have very low values. In the United States, EPA and the Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Highway Administration, they're all about between $9 and $10 million per person. on the
I know.
VOSL. But if you apply the principles rigorously for the earning capacity of somebody 60, 70, 80, that's going to go down significantly. And that will be a major controversy. You know.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Well,
very
getting to
much.
be 7:30.
It's
Getting
a
close to
time to close.
the
But,
award ceremony.
yeah, anyone has a very burning question? If please,
I
like
see
to ask just one.
Mosen raising his hand. Norio and
Hello.
Mosen.
I just want to say hello to everybody.
Hi.
Okay. How about
And-
Norio? Do you have burning question?
Well, I don't like to be long, so let me just brief. Thank you for your excellent talk and also the
Hi, Manus.
answers and excellent interactions.
Hi.
I was just wondering in what way, we could appreciate your work from the viewpoint of potential customers of your modeling and research works. And policy is one factor. But there seem to be a lot of different actors and agents involved in this complex question. So, for instance, scenarios even can be controlled somehow by political sectors, one way, but also, well, some sort of industrial sectors or companies could somehow make decisions. So they need also their own policies. But say immediately, let me just mention one thing. I'm also very much interested from the viewpoint of potential investors, or so to say, investors who are very much sort of say what is called SEG, ESG, environmental, social, and governance concerned, investment. So for them, your work might be very also useful.
Well, thank you. I appreciate any context. Can you see this on my screen? You are screen share. Can you see this?
Yes.
So this is a 1-minute video on a business resilience calculator we just developed, and indulge me for a minute. I don't know if you can.
Adam, we're not seeing the video.
No.
Oh, you're not.
No,
unfortunately.
I don't. You are. It says.
The share.
Let me stop this. So it says I'm screen sharing.
but you're still sharing the PPT file.
Oh, really? Okay. Let me get rid of that. Sorry, and let me see if I. Where did I? Let me try it. Oh. Yeah. Well, anyway, we developed something called the Business Resilience Calculator. If you to help businesses assess their resilience, and we rushed out a version of it for COVID-19. So if anybody wants to see this, and I would have thought this would be on my desktop. Let me try one.
You can, Adam, just stop sharing. And then again, say share, and then click on the video.
Yeah, right.
Oh, okay. All right.
Share screen again, and then.
All right. Now the problem is, okay, screen share and BRC. Okay.
Oh, yes. I see.
Designed to help business owners make cost-effective resilience investments to reduce losses during an emergency. The calculator uses real data from real businesses that have survived disasters. You'll begin by performing a self-assessment. Then, the BRC allows users to evaluate the most cost-effective actions under a wide range of business interruptions. You'll receive highly detailed interactive results, and you can compare metrics from businesses just like yours. We are constantly the available data with each new user. So log on today and see what the Business Resilience Calculator can do for you.
Okay, so all you missed were some introductions about the businesses tending to fail when they have problems. But if anybody, all you have to do, actually just look up resiliencecalculator.com and you'll be able to see the video and the link. So this has just been released, and it's available for free actually at this point for the demo version.
Okay.
All right. So I don't want to cut into the time for the awards ceremony, so I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to be quiet and turn things back over to Hiro,
Yes.
and Anna Maria and Maria.
For this was a wonderful keynote sessions. Okay, we would like to give Adam's a big hand to thank his wonderful talk. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you.
You're welcome.